The story you have been told for the past 2 years is collapsing in real time. You were assured that the Black Sea had settled into a frozen stalemate, a static chessboard where no decisive move was possible. That narrative is no longer defensible. A fundamental shift has occurred, one the West failed to anticipate and even failed to recognize until it was already irreversible. Russia has opened what can only be described as the Odessa corridor, and this single development represents the most severe strategic setback the Western alliance has suffered since the conflict began. This is not a minor battlefield adjustment or a fleeting tactical gain. It is a calculated strike at the economic and military core of what remains of the Ukrainian state, and its implications extend far beyond one city or one coastline. What is unfolding is not about the capture of Odessa itself, nor is it limited to the fate of a port. It marks the beginning of the end for Ukraine's maritime independence and, by extension, a profound strategic defeat for NATO. The West misread the board, misunderstood the objective, and walked directly into a trap shaped by geography, history, and industrial power. This assessment does not rely on shallow television analysis or recycled political slogans. It follows a strategic realist framework grounded in military realities and long-term geopolitical logic, and it confronts the facts without comfort or illusion. To understand why this matters, we must examine how this operation was executed, why Brussels and Washington are signaling panic, and why this corridor represents NATO's worst strategic scenario realized. Russia's recent move is not simply a military maneuver, it is a sophisticated act of strategic engineering. By asserting control over the sea lanes approaching Odessa, Moscow has effectively established a protected shipping corridor under its influence while extending its operational perimeter across the western Black Sea coast. This redefines the geography of the war itself. The question is no longer how Russia achieved this position, but why Odessa was always the objective. The answer lies in the city's role as Ukraine's last viable deep-water port. Before the war, Odessa and its neighboring ports handled most of Ukraine's exports, especially grain and steel. These were not marginal commodities. They were the backbone of Ukraine's economy and a critical supply source for global markets, particularly across the global south. Control of the northwestern Black Sea is not symbolic. It functions like a tourniquet applied to Ukraine's economic bloodstream. By opening this corridor, Russia has gained the ability to regulate, restrict, or permit the movement of food and industrial goods on a global scale. This single shift transforms a regional war into a mechanism of global leverage. It also reshapes the strategic balance across the entire Black Sea basin. The pressure now extends beyond key to NATO members, such as Romania and Bulgaria, and most importantly to Turkey, which controls access through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles. This is classic choke point strategy, where dominance over a narrow geographic space generates outsized economic and political power. The reaction from NATO has been telling: quiet emergency meetings, muted language, and a sudden pivot from talk of victory to talk of stabilization reveal a deep unease. Western leaders are now confronting a military reality they consistently dismissed. Russia demonstrated its capacity to concentrate forces for a decisive theater-level objective, something NATO planners underestimated. This operation was not improvised. It followed a deliberate buildup of logistics, air superiority, and the systematic neutralization of Ukrainian naval capabilities. It also exposed a deeper failure, one rooted in geography. Western strategists treated Ukraine as a modern European state detached from history. Russia treated it as a centuries-old security buffer on its southern flank. That difference in perspective shaped everything that followed. To fully understand why Odessa matters this much, we must move beyond current headlines and examine the deeper historical forces that made it such a critical prize. That context reveals why this was never a peripheral objective and why its loss changes the strategic landscape entirely. The importance of Odessa did not begin in 2022, nor did it suddenly emerge after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Its strategic value for Moscow is far older, deeply rooted in imperial history and enduring geopolitical necessity. The city's role traces back to the Novorossiya project initiated by Empress Catherine the Great. After wresting the region from Ottoman control in the late 18th century, Catherine founded Odessa in 1794 as a deliberate geopolitical instrument. This was not an organic settlement that happened to grow into significance. It was designed from inception to serve as Russia's gateway to warm waters, a requirement that has shaped Russian strategic thinking for nearly 3 centuries. For much of its history, Odessa ranked among the most important cities of the Russian Empire. It stood as the fourth largest urban center, a cosmopolitan hub of commerce, finance, and naval power. Its purpose was clear and non-negotiable: to channel the agricultural wealth of the vast southern steppe onto global markets. Grain exports from Odessa fueled imperial revenues, strengthened diplomatic leverage, and anchored Russia's role in global trade. The city also functioned as a principal naval base in the undisputed center of Black Sea commerce. Control of the coastline from Crimea, annexed in 1783, westward to the Dniester estuary, was never a casual ambition. It was a consistent military and economic objective pursued across generations. This strategic imperative surfaced repeatedly in history's most violent chapters. From the Napoleonic Wars to the Crimean War and through both world wars, control of the Black Sea littoral remained a central factor in every major confrontation involving Russia. The modern articulation of this objective was not hidden. Early in the current conflict, Russian commanders openly discussed securing southern Ukraine to form a continuous land corridor. This corridor was intended to connect newly occupied territories to Crimea and potentially extend further west toward Transnistria and Moldova. This was not abstract expansionism. It reflected a calculated effort to secure economic access, strategic depth, and defensive continuity along Russia's southern flank. Western policymakers largely failed to grasp this continuity. Their miscalculations stem from a fundamental mismatch in strategic time horizons. Western governments operate within short electoral cycles, reacting to immediate political pressure and headline-driven narratives. Moscow, by contrast, plans within a century-long framework, prioritizing enduring security over short-term optics. Western capitals viewed Odessa as a modern Ukrainian port whose sovereignty should be preserved. Russia viewed it as unfinished strategic business, central to the security of its Black Sea fleet and indispensable to maintaining a viable warm water outlet. This disconnect was compounded by a neglect of the broader Black Sea architecture. The Montreux Convention of 1936, which governs access through the Turkish Straits, and the persistent naval competition involving Turkey, have always revolved around physical control of territory and ports. Without secure control of Odessa, Crimea remains strategically exposed, vulnerable to interdiction and isolation. The events unfolding today are not anomalies. They are the contemporary expression of a struggle that has defined regional power dynamics for generations. While Russia's withdrawal from Kherson represented a tactical setback, Odessa quickly became Kiev's primary strategic lifeline. Western focus remained fixed on attritional battles in the eastern Donbass, assuming territorial gains there would define the war's outcome. This misjudgment allowed Moscow the time and operational freedom to shape conditions along the coast. Russia was never fighting solely for land in the east. Its true center of gravity lay in controlling the economic arteries of the Black Sea coastline. That long, patient setup now leads directly to the operational reality on the ground. To understand the magnitude of this shift, we must examine how the Odessa corridor was opened, not through spectacle or sudden assault, but through a methodical and calculated strategy designed to break Ukraine's coastal defenses without ever needing to storm the city itself. The opening of the Odessa corridor was not the result of a dramatic amphibious landing or a single decisive clash, despite years of Western analysts fixating on that scenario. Instead, it was achieved through a calculated squeeze, a patient and methodical campaign that combined long-range firepower, supply line disruption, and sustained attrition. This approach targeted the structural weaknesses in Ukraine's coastal defense and exposed the limits of NATO's logistical support model. The objective was never rapid occupation, it was isolation, exhaustion, and control. The first and most critical phase focused on severing the logistical arteries, sustaining the Odessa region and the remnants of Ukraine's Black Sea naval Kia, did not prioritize territorial conquest. In this phase, it pursued logistical starvation. This meant a relentless campaign of precision strikes using standoff weapons, including glide bombs, cruise missiles, and other long-range systems aimed squarely at infrastructure. Rail hubs, fuel depots, ammunition storage sites, and transport nodes became primary targets. Even more crucial were the bridges and rail connections linking Odessa to the rest of Ukraine and to NATO's primary supply routes through Romania. The repeated strikes on the Zatoka Bridge were not symbolic acts of terror or random destruction. That bridge carries a vital coastal rail line near the Romanian border, and its neutralization signaled a clear strategic intent. By degrading that link, Russia choked the flow of military supplies, heavy equipment, and economic cargo into the region. Over time, these attacks transformed the entire coastal defense zone into a logistical burden rather than an asset. Ports that once served as lifelines became liabilities, unable to support sustained military or commercial throughput under constant threat. At sea, the balance shifted just as decisively. What had once appeared as a contested environment evolved into clear Russian area denial dominance. Ukrainian naval drones achieved notable tactical successes early on, damaging individual Russian vessels and shaping public perception. But these attacks failed to undermine Russia's core advantage, layered air defenses, and long-range strike capability. Moscow adapted quickly, repositioning its fleet into protected anchorages and reinforcing defensive systems. The deployment of dense anti-ship and land attack missile networks effectively pushed Ukraine's operational maritime space back toward its own shoreline. This did not resemble a traditional naval blockade with visible ship formations. It was a passive blockade that turned active when necessary. The Black Sea became a firing zone where the risk to commercial shipping was unacceptably high. Insurance rates surged, routes became untenable, and independent maritime trade collapsed under the weight of threat alone. Control was exerted not by presence but by capability, and that distinction mattered. Maritime commerce depends on predictability, and Russia destroyed it. The final and decisive pressure came from land operations elsewhere. Russian advances in the Eastern Theater, particularly deep penetrations near key logistical corridors, forced Kiev into a strategic dilemma. Ukraine committed its most experienced and capable brigades to the grinding battles of the Donbass. This was the trap. By fixing Ukraine's strategic reserves hundreds of miles away, Russia quietly stripped the Odessa and Mykolaiv sectors of defensive depth. Coastal defenses were left undermanned, overstretched, and brittle. This was not accidental. It was strategic deception through pressure. Political necessity compelled Kiev to hold the eastern line at all costs, even as that decision weakened its southern flank. The defense of the coast was sacrificed to preserve symbolic territorial positions inland. Once that balance tipped, the corridor effectively opened itself. The result is unmistakable. Russia now holds local military dominance in the northwestern Black Sea and controls the means of access in and out of Ukraine's last maritime gateway. Odessa has shifted from being a strategic lifeline to becoming a severe economic and military vulnerability. This single maneuver denies Ukraine a significant portion of its export revenue and alters the balance of power across the region. With that dominance established, the focus must now shift to what this means for NATO itself and for the credibility of Western security guarantees moving forward. Viewed through the lens of strategic realism, the successful establishment of the Odessa corridor is not merely a setback for Ukraine. It is a decisive validation of Russia's attrition-based approach, and more importantly, a damning indictment of NATO's long-term strategic failure. The core problem lies not in battlefield tactics, but in the West's substitution of political rhetoric for sustained military capability. Western leaders promised unwavering support and spoke openly of Ukrainian victory. Yet what they delivered was a carefully calibrated flow of assistance designed to prolong resistance without enabling decisive success. That approach created a war of exhaustion that inevitably favored the larger, more industrially prepared power. This strategy collapsed on two fundamental levels, both directly contributing to the loss of maritime control. First, Western planners became strategically narrow in their focus. Attention remained fixed on the grinding ground battles in the eastern Donbass, while the Black Sea, the true geoeconomic pressure point, was treated as secondary. Control of the Black Sea was never a peripheral issue. It is central to power projection, economic survival, and regional dominance. By allowing Russia to systematically degrade Ukraine's coastal defenses through sustained logistical pressure, NATO effectively enabled the final maneuver that sealed Odessa's fate. The long-range strike campaign that crippled ports, rail links, and energy infrastructure was allowed to continue with limited interference. Theater-level air defense systems capable of denying that space, such as widespread integrated Patriot coverage, were either delivered too late in insufficient quantities or not at all. This was not a failure of courage on the battlefield, but a failure of prioritization at the strategic level. The West attempted to manage escalation politically rather than confront it militarily, and the result was predictable. The second failure was industrial. As analysts like Douglas MacGregor have long argued, modern wars of attrition are won in factories, not press conferences. Russia mobilized and retooled its industrial base to sustain high-volume production of artillery shells, drones, glide bombs, and cruise missiles. These systems were not glamorous, but they were effective, cheap, and produced at scale. Western defense industries, by contrast, remained largely on a peacetime footing. Output could not match consumption, and delivery timelines lagged far behind battlefield realities. This disparity proved decisive along the coast. Russia exploited its ability to maintain a constant, overwhelming volume of fire, turning infrastructure into debris faster than it could be repaired. Western reliance on expensive specialized systems failed to counter the sheer mass and persistence of Russian strikes. Precision matters, but quantity matters more when the objective is sustained logistical paralysis. In that context, the West was structurally unprepared. The implications for NATO now extend well beyond Ukraine. The Black Sea is no longer a contested buffer zone. It has effectively become a Russian-dominated space, placing NATO's southeastern members under direct and continuous strategic pressure. Romania and Bulgaria now face a militarized maritime frontier, forcing the alliance to consider permanent reinforcement, expanded air defenses, and sustained naval presence. These commitments carry enormous financial and operational costs at a time when Western industrial capacity is already strained. More damaging still is the erosion of deterrence. Deterrence depends on credibility, and credibility depends on the alignment of political intent with material capability. When Moscow observes red lines repeatedly crossed without decisive response, and when it sees Western industry unable to support declared commitments, confidence in NATO's resolve diminishes. The opening of the Odessa corridor confirms from Russia's perspective that the West is either unwilling or unable to reverse a major strategic loss once it occurs. This shift now forces a reckoning. The alliance must confront the reality that failure to deter Russia from achieving a critical coastal objective has reshaped the strategic environment permanently. The question moving forward is no longer whether this outcome can be undone, but how far Moscow will press its advantage and what risks NATO is prepared to accept in response. The answers to those questions will define the next phase of this conflict and the broader balance of power across Eastern Europe. The establishment of the Odessa corridor is not an endpoint. It is the opening move in a new and far more dangerous phase of the conflict, one that forces every NATO capital to reassess escalation thresholds and strategic risk. The illusion that this war can remain geographically contained has been shattered. And Moscow now holds the initiative, and the plausible future scenarios that follow from this position are deeply concerning not only for Ukraine, but for the stability of Eastern Europe as a whole. The central question is no longer whether Russia will consolidate its gains, but how far it is willing to go and how the West will respond under mounting political pressure. One likely scenario is consolidation without occupation. Russia does not need to storm Odessa's streets to achieve its objectives. By maintaining absolute maritime dominance and sustained air superiority over Odessa and neighboring ports, Moscow can effectively neutralize Ukraine's entire maritime economy. This approach achieves the vast majority of strategic goals while avoiding the high human and logistical cost. Ukraine would be left in a state of permanent economic vulnerability, its trade arteries severed, its fiscal base weakened, and its long-term viability as an independent state severely compromised. In this outcome, the war hardens into a frozen conflict defined by maritime control rather than shifting front lines. Another plausible development involves a westward extension of this strategy. With the coastal flank secured and logistics stabilized, Russia could pursue a long-discussed objective linking up with the Russian-backed region of Transnistria and Moldova from the newly established coastal perimeter. Such a move would carry comparatively low operational risk. Achieving a land-quartered Transnistria would secure the entire southwestern flank of the Novorossiya concept, while simultaneously applying direct pressure to Moldova's sovereignty. More critically, it would push the conflict to the immediate edge of NATO territory, particularly Romania, dramatically shrinking the strategic buffer zone. This scenario would place enormous strain on NATO cohesion. Article 5 commitments, response timelines, and escalation thresholds would move from theoretical debates to urgent operational planning. The alliance, already divided over risk tolerance and burden sharing, would face unprecedented pressure to demonstrate unity in the face of a rapidly advancing strategic reality. Even without direct combat, the psychological impact of Russian forces operating along NATO's border would be profound. The most dangerous scenario involves miscalculation driven by political desperation. Faced with a humiliating loss of credibility, NATO could attempt to break the blockade directly by deploying advanced air defenses, naval assets, or combat aircraft into the Odessa region with the explicit goal of protecting commercial shipping. This is precisely the kind of move that carries the highest escalation risk. The Black Sea would instantly become a direct confrontation zone between Russian long-range strike systems and Western military assets. Such an engagement would not resemble past proxy conflicts. It would create a dynamic where any strike, interception, or misinterpreted movement could trigger rapid escalation. Russian missile attacks aimed at neutralizing NATO systems could provoke retaliatory strikes deeper into Russian-held territory, potentially even within Russia itself. Escalation in this context would not be carefully managed. It would be chaotic, compressed, and dangerously unpredictable. The underlying risk here is psychological. Strategic humiliation creates powerful incentives for reckless action. Political leaders under domestic pressure to restore credibility may act not because escalation is strategically sound, but because inaction appears politically untenable. History shows that major conflicts often escalate not through deliberate choice, but through the mismanagement of defeat. Thanks for watching. Your support means everything. Please like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more important updates coming your way.